The snow had thinned by morning, giving the illusion of warmth, yet the wind dragged its fingers across the plain, low and mournful like distant cello strings. John stood at the edge of the corral, one gloved hand resting on the rail, eyes following the lazy sway of frost-edged fence posts. Behind him, smoke curled from the chimney, dark against a sky too wide to bear alone. Inside the cabin, breakfast passed in quiet ritual. The clink of spoons against tin bowls, the rustle of log fire and wool. Ellie sat curled on the bench nearest the hearth, legs drawn beneath her, watching the flicker of light dance across her mother's face. Martha, lifting her chin now and then to scan the window pane, said little, but her fingers moved swiftly, mending a tear in John's spare coat with a care that belied her declaration the night before. "We'll go when the fog lifts. Cousins in Oregon. A 3-week ride, perhaps. No sense overstaying welcome." John had only nodded. He wasn't a man to argue with firm words. But Ellie had caught the hesitation in his eyes flicker like the pause before a page is turned too hastily. Later, when the chores were met and the water hauled from the creek's edge, Ellie wandered beyond the barn. Her boots pressed into the thawing ground, careful prints upon the earth like sentences just beginning. She was searching not for anything she could name, but for the shape of knowledge, a meaning behind wind, frost, and the stillness of the orchard. John followed at a distance, not to intrude, but because he felt somewhat absurdly that the land said more when she walked upon it. From behind the old smoking oak, he watched as the girl knelt beside the stunted apple tree. She brushed melting snow from its warped bark, then leaned close, her cheek level with a crooked branch. "It's still trying," came her voice, soft yet certain. John stepped forward. "She was just a slip from Devon," he said quietly. "Brought over in a coat pocket, roots wrapped in damp muslin. I feared she wouldn't take, and the first winter proved me near right. But," she held on, his mouth twisted into something between pride and penance. "She?" Ellie asked. "My wife's tree," John admitted. "She always said planting was hope made visible." Ellie considered this, then tilted her face toward a patch of pale sunlight. Her hands, mottled with cold, still rested on the trunk as though listening. "She likes it here now, I think," she said. John looked over the plain, wind-sweeping tall grasses in waves. Somewhere beneath, seeds dreamed of spring. He felt it deep a tug, not unlike grief, yet kinder. A quiet pull towards something not distant, but near and possible. Behind them, the cabin waited, smoke curling, bread rising, and Martha's eyes pausing longer than before at the window. The wind that day came from the north, brittle as glass and colder than the bones of old men who mutter in their sleep. Snow lingered in the creases of the prairie grass, a thin shroud that whispered of decay and waiting. John Whitaker, his collar turned high and mittens thick with wool, made his slow pass along the edge of the barn, wondering if the chickens had found their courage. That's when he saw her. The woman was hardly visible at first, a silhouette drawn low against the wood, knees held close, a ragged shawl pulled around her shoulders. Beside her sat a girl, no more than 12, slim and still, cradling half a rotten apple as though it were a prayer. The girl's cheeks were red from the wind, her lips cracked and trembling, and yet she watched him, her eyes wide, waiting, unblinking. John stopped. The snow issued no sound, but the silence between them stirred something ancient. He was not a man who believed in fate, but memories stirred, like embers, a hill in Devon. Emily, with her shawl blowing in the salt air, That same look of resolve, harbored in the thinness of the mouth, the hollows beneath the eyes. He stepped forward, slowly so as not to alarm. The woman's back straightened. She shifted slightly, placing herself more directly between him and the girl. Protective, proud, she said nothing. John reached a hand to his buttons, loosening the heavy wool coat from his shoulders. The cold bit quickly, but he cared little. Crossing the remaining feet, he bent gently. The girl flinched not from him, but from the sharp air now between coat and skin. He draped the garment over her shoulders. It fell too long for her frame, brushing the ground. The woman stood, eyes narrowed under her threadbare bonnet. "You've no call," she began, her voice clenched as a door against the wind. "I do," John said, simply. He met her gaze. "It's too cold for pride." The woman didn't answer at first. She looked at the coat enveloping her daughter. Her chin quivered, then steadied. "Just for the night," she managed. "Will not impose." John nodded once toward the cabin. "Come in, then." They followed cautious shadows in the blur of white. When he opened the cabin door, a ribbon of warmth spilled into the cold. He stood aside and let them enter first. Ellie's feet lingered at the threshold. She peered curiously around the doorframe. Shelves of neatly stacked wood, a cast-iron stove, lavender swaying softly overhead. John stepped in last, closing the door with care. The wind beat once more against the wall, but it could not enter. Inside, silence softened into something else. Not comfort, not yet, but promise. The flames in the hearth crackled softly, casting long, flickering shadows against the log walls of John Whitaker's cabin. Evening had settled sullen and snow-heavy, its breath pressing hard against the windows. Inside, there was a tentative warmth that belonged more to silence than to fire. Martha Davies sat stiffly on the edge of the chair nearest the door, boots still damp, her shawl now steaming near the hearth. Ellie curled beside the fire on a small rug, her legs tucked beneath her. A mug of mint tea, too warm to drink Jew. Saint yet sat beside her like a gift not meant for keeping. John moved without noise, placing another split log into the cast-iron stove. He did not speak. There was no need to. The room seemed to listen closely enough on its own. "You keep your wood dry," Martha said at last, eyes fixed on the fire. Her voice held the cadence of a compliment, unwilling to be too soft. "I stack north-facing. Wind rolls off the rise," John answered, brushing sawdust from one cuff. He didn't look at her when he spoke, but his words held the courtesy of real conversation. Ellie glanced between them, then settled her gaze on the sprigs of dried lavender hanging above the corner cupboard. "It smells like spring," she said quietly, and something in John's face seemed to pause before relaxing by increments. "My wife used to hang it," he said, almost absently. "Keeps mice from the grain, and dreams from growing too cold, I suppose." Martha's fingers tightened slightly in her lap. "She gone long?" "8 winters," John said. He did not elaborate. A silence settled again, touched only by the creaking of wood and the pop of pine resin in the fire. Ellie leaned closer to her mother's side. "I won't keep you," John said at last, his tone as even as ever. "But you'll be warmer here, at least till the wind lets us forget its voice." Martha nodded slowly. "One night," John inclined his head, as if sealing the agreement with solemn care. Later, as darkness thickened outside and the wind howled a mournful note across the roof's pitch, Martha rose and fetched a spare quilt from the foot of the bunk. Without remark, John took another and laid it near the hearth. He watched as Ellie's face softened in the firelight. her mouth parted slightly in the calm of a child no longer cold. Martha glanced toward him. "Thank you," she said, and the words were ironed smooth with sincerity. He offered a small bow of his head, another relic from some distant drawing-room or parlor in Devonshire. "You're under my roof now. That must count for something still." And as the last log cracked down to ember, the hush between them was no longer hesitant but whole. The kettle whistled gently. John rose, timing it with practiced ease, and poured the steeping water into 3 mismatched cups lined along the edge of the hearth. The mint leaves curled in the steam like green ribbons, and Ellie, watching with wide eyes from the bench, leaned forward. "Proper tea," John murmured, nodding to no one in particular. Martha accepted her cup without a word, her fingers brushing the handle as if uncertain how long the warmth would hold. Outside, the wind howled against the walls of the ranch house, dusting snow like salt across the single-paned windows. Inside, silence breathed between them, a lull not of uneasiness, but of adjustment. Ellie wrapped both hands around her cup, the sleeves of her patched dress falling back enough to show reddened wrists. "It tastes like something green," she said quietly, after her first sip. "It is," John replied, with a trace of a smile. "From a plant I dug before the frost. Mint grows wild not far east of here. Hardy thing, clings to the roots even through snow." The girl nodded solemnly, as if committing the fact to memory. Her dark eyes flicked to take in the low ceiling beams, where lavender sprigs hung dried and fragile. Unused to such quiet, she seemed to hum with unspoken questions. Martha, meanwhile, focused on the crackle of firewood, her own tea untouched. She had shed neither cloak nor wariness. "Lavender," John gestured upward. "My wife planted it once, claimed it helped keep moths out the linen." His voice near broke on the second word. He cleared his throat. "I didn't expect—" Martha started, then stopped. Her voice, usually brisk, was softer, as though words here needed rounding. "Most men wouldn't offer charity to strangers on their land?" John glanced at her, gray eyes steady. "This isn't charity." Martha raised an eyebrow. "It's weather," he said, placing his cup down with care. "It drives us in. Some alone, some not. A man can choose to bar his door or not." A long moment passed, only fire noise between them. "I told Ellie we'd only stay one night," Martha said finally, "to keep warm and move on." "Understandable," John replied, folding his hands over one knee. He looked toward the window where snow gusted sideways like chalk on slate. "Still, there's no movement today. The roads turn to powder." Ellie turned slightly, and her voice came light. "Do you read those books?" She pointed to a shelf where dog-eared volumes lined in uneven tilt. "When I find the right lighting, sometimes aloud, to the chickens mostly." His voice took a dry twist, and Ellie giggled. Martha smiled faintly, briefly the kind that had forgotten it knew how. Above them, the lavender trembled with the wind's push against the eaves, and the tea, still warm in their hands, cast up a fragrant little steam, curling softly in a silence that was beginning just barely to feel like peace. The wind that morning was little more than a whisper, but it carried the bite of cold days to come. John Whitaker stood by the edge of his porch, mug in hand, steam curling from the tea like breath from a tethered horse. His eyes, steady and gray, swept the empty field beyond his pasture fence before settling on the lone apple tree barren now, its limbs brittle with frost. He did not move. Not yet. The silence around him was not empty. It held something unspoken, like a page not turned. Inside, the hearth murmured to itself. Martha moved quietly around the stove, the skirts of her worn dress brushing the planked floor. She worked without conversation, eyes focused, hands deliberate. John had offered her breakfast, and she had accepted with a nod. Ellie still slept, nested in quilts by the fire, mouth slightly open, hair splayed wild across the pillow. In sleep, she looked younger. John re-entered the cabin with considered steps, removing his hat out of habit despite there being no congregation to face. He set it on the peg near the door and stood for a moment, letting the warmth etch itself back into his bones. "You took your time," Martha said, not accusing, not warm. "I did." Martha poured another cup of tea and set it at the edge of the table. She didn't look at him as he approached, and when their fingers brushed as he reached, she withdrew into herself like a tide retreating from shore. He lifted the cup slowly. "I should prepare the shed. Storm comes the day after next, if the sky speaks true." "I've known skies to lie," she murmured. A moment passed, filled only by the creak of wood settling, the rhythmic spit of logs in the stove. John sipped. The mint leaf lingered, bitter and fresh, all at once. "You'll stay through it," he said, more observation than invitation. Martha didn't answer immediately. She worked the hem of Ellie's shawl with needle and thread, her thimble catching glimpses of the firelight. "I don't mean to impose," she finally said. "You're not." Her eyes rose, now quiet but clearer, as if she were sifting feeling through layers of caution. "You say very little, Mr. Whitaker." "Yes, but you watch everything." He didn't deny it. Instead, he said, "No one notices the apple tree come springtime. Come autumn, they think it bloomed overnight." She was quiet, but her posture changed just slightly. The thread snapped below her fingers. She tied a knot and laid the shawl aside. Ellie stirred gently. As if hearing, even in sleep, John looked toward the fire and spoke once more. "Some things need silence to grow." Outside, wind pressed gently against the cabin walls and, finding no protest, moved on. Snow blanketed the plain so thickly it seemed to muffle time itself. Days slid into one another without crisp beginning or end. The world outside John's cabin had narrowed to the reach of the windows and the flicker of the hearth. Inside, silence filled the corners like warmth does a teacup ceremonially and only after some quiet waiting. Ellie sat cross-legged near the fireplace, her eyes wide while John read from a worn volume of Wordsworth, pausing now and then in thought. His voice, soft and measured, blended with the soft crackling of oak logs. Martha mended a shirt by lantern light, her fingers working briskly, although a faint softness began to settle around her mouth, a release of tension almost too subtle to name. The stories came without fanfare. First, Martha spoke haltingly at first off her father's sermons back in Birmingham, how his words echoed off stone walls, heavy as the bell that called parishioners in from the soot-lined streets. "He'd always pause after the last verse," she said, looking toward the small frosted window, as if waiting for something to change. Her voice faded above the clink of John setting down his teacup. John replied with recollections of Devonshire hills layered in dew, of fog, ling from valley edges like parchment. "There was a time I would walk alone before the schoolhouse bell," he said. "Watch hares scatter at my footsteps. Simple things." His gaze stayed on the fire, but his voice grew more present, as though he welcomed the return of every word laid like a trail behind him. Ellie, curled beside the old bloodhound Bramble, whispered, "But what did the sea sound like, Mr. Whitaker?" He turned to look at her, then slowly leaned back. "Like something trying to remember, like wind tugging at the edge of a story." The silence that followed was full not empty as if each of them was sorting through the folded drawers of memory, pulling out what could still be worn. Later that evening, Gray Fox arrived, the snow clinging to his shoulders like a mantle of ghosts. He traded smoked venison and dried choke cherries for a spool of metal wire and a bundle of wool. As he accepted a tin cup of mint tea, his gaze moved slowly over the hearth, the trio of shapes framed in orange light. "You have opened the door," he said at last, his words for John, but his eyes on Ellie. "Not all places are warmed with wood alone." The rest nodded without fully understanding, but they remembered it all the same. That night, as wind curled against the eaves like smoke, Martha caught John meticulously sewing a patch on his worn jacket by lamplight. "Didn't peg you for needlework," she said, half teasing. John offered a rare smile. "Well, one learns things when there's no one else around to mend what tears." For once, Martha did not look away. The snow had fallen again overnight, capping the prairie in stillness. The wind hissed softly through the chinks in the cabin walls, but inside the hearth gave off a steady warmth. John was bent near the fire, methodically reshaping a bent horseshoe, while Ellie perched on the edge of the wood bin, watching his movements with quiet fascination. Martha, sleeves rolled, was washing a small pile of sewing cloth in the steaming basin. "This water never stays warm long enough," she muttered, though not unkindly. Her voice was steadier these days, less guarded, though her eyes still pried at shadows now and then. Then came a sound, faint through the wind, the crunch of boots on frost-packed snow. John straightened. Ellie turned toward the door, her gaze alert. Seconds later, a knock, one, then two slow raps. John stepped across the room and pulled the heavy latch. The door creaked inward and let in a gust of air sharp with cedar smoke. Standing there was Gray Fox, cloaked in fur-lined leather, his breath misting into the room's warmth. Over one shoulder was an oilskin bundle tightly wrapped, and in his other hand, a long walking staff. "You have kept the fire," he said, stepping just inside. John nodded. "We've had reason to this winter." Gray Fox's eyes rested briefly on Ellie, then Martha, before returning to John. "And the door has stayed open." John allowed himself a small, wry smile. "Just as, well, or I'd talk only to chickens." Gray Fox grunted a soft laugh and moved toward the fire without further invitation. Ellie, emboldened, brought him a cup of warm water sweetened with dried mint. He accepted it with a solemn nod. From the bundle, he unwrapped a cylindrical package, a small clay pot sealed with wax, and a handful of dry resin sticks wrapped in birch bark. "Fire gift," he said to John, "made with pine sap and sage, burns long for cold nights." Martha looked at the resin sticks with measured curiosity. "It's a kindness." Gray Fox's gaze settled on her. "Long roads bring tired spirits. Fire is a good thing to share when words are thinning." That silenced the room a moment. Then Ellie whispered, "Do you make it yourself?" Gray Fox turned to her slowly. "The land makes it. I only ask it kindly." Ellie's eyes widened in quiet awe. After a length of silence, Gray Fox stood. "Your roof holds. That is good." He stepped toward the door. John followed him out. The horizon glowed faint rose through rows of sleeping apple limbs. "You've done more than open a door," Gray Fox said softly. John looked down, snow creaking beneath his boots. "I've kept to myself too long," he admitted. "Thought that was strength." Gray Fox merely smiled. "Maybe so, but strength is also knowing when to pass the flame." He turned, his footsteps sure on the crusted snow, and was gone across the prairie. The afternoon light sifted through pale clouds, casting a silver glow over the orchard's edge. The snow had melted in thin rivulets, pooling against roots still stiff with frost. John knelt near the gnarled apple tree closest to the fence line, his gloved hand brushing away a torn scrap of winter. The graft linea winding seam halfway up the trunk cod held another year. Behind him, soft footsteps approached. He did not turn immediately. "It survived, then?" Martha's voice was low but not fragile. John straightened carefully, wiping his palms on his coat hem. He offered a small nod. "Planted it the year Emily passed. A wild root with a piece from her favorite orchard in Devonshire. Wasn't sure it'd take to Kansas soil." Martha glanced at the trunk, then at the sparse buds beginning to press their way into spring. And yet it did. John allowed the silence afterward to stretch wide. Not from discomfort but reverence. He had learned not to crowd moments like these with explanations. The breeze moved through the grass with a hush, as if eavesdropping. "She used to say," he offered finally, "that some things bloom best when they think no one's watching." Martha smiled faintly. "She sounds like someone Ellie would have liked." Ellie, a little ways off, crouched with a trowel and a clay pot of young seedlings. She'd become enamored with the growing thing shad named the hens and memorized the soil's scent when it turned soft. Martha tilted her gaze toward her daughter, eyes narrow from sun and thought. "She wants to stay," Martha said more, "to the wind than to him." John looked toward the orchard, then back to her. "And you?" For the briefest moment, her composure trembled barely. "I don't know how to be still anymore." "I understand," he replied. "But roots don't shame the wind. They simply know when to hold." She seemed to weigh the words, jaw tightening before softening again. "You speak like a man who still reads poetry by lamplight." "I might," John said, the corners of his mouth lifting with restraint, "on quiet evenings." Ellie stood then, crossing to them with her palms cupped around a sapling. "May I?" she asked, and John nodded. She knelt beside the older tree's shadow and dug patiently, setting her small root down just beside his wife's, a child's offering. A quiet echo. "I'll see this grow straight," she said, her voice colored with promise. "You will," John answered. Martha, watching her daughter plant something of her own, let out a slow breath. It curled like steam in the cold air between them, not escape, but release. John stepped back, allowing the space between them to fill not with need, but shared knowing. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing the orchard awake, and the tree, once stubborn against Kansas frost, held its place, firm untouched, blossoms folding inward, waiting. The orchard had begun to stir. Beneath a pale sky stitched with spring light, slender green buds dotted the apple branches, taut with promise. Ellie stood beside the oldest tree, the one John had shown her just days before. Gnarled at the base, twisted from frost and years, it bowed slightly toward the barn as if in reverence or resignation. She traced a finger over the bark, cold and knobbled. "It's not pretty," she murmured. "No," John said softly behind her, "but it's endured." Ellie turned at his voice. He knelt in the damp earth nearby, holding out something wrapped in burlap small, round, and trembling in his palm. "An apple seed, from the harvest last year. Not many survived the frost. I saved this one." Ellie took it in her hands carefully, as though it might fly away. She looked up. "Can I plant it by this one?" John studied her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I believe that's the right place." They dug together in silence. John carving the hole with sure hands, Ellie crouched beside him with her palms resting in the moistened soil. A robin chirped high amid the budding branches, unseen but sure in its song. When the hole was ready, Ellie placed the seed into the earth with small, reverent fingers. Then she covered it over and patted the dirt flat. "Will it grow?" she asked. "It might," John said, gazing toward the horizon. "But that isn't why we plant." Ellie nodded, though she didn't quite know what he meant. Martha watched from the doorway of the cabin, her arms foldedless in judgment now than in thought. She had been packing since morning, folding dresses tight into their satchel, curling her fingers over the map dappled with Oregon roots. But her hands hadn't moved in the last hour. Later, when the skies slipped toward evening, Martha came to the orchard. Ellie held her hand out to her mother without speaking, pulling her toward the tiny, unmarked mound. "I planted it," Ellie said. "Right here." There was a long pause. The wind tugged the tip of Martha's bonnet. "I don't want to go," Ellie whispered, not looking up. "Not yet." Martha crouched beside her. Her gaze passed over the soil, the girl, and then beyond to John's profile, still visible by the barn, the steady curve of his shoulders against the light. The silence settled deep. At last, she exhaled. "We'll stay through planting," she murmured. "Help him sow the season." Ellie turned to her, slow but shining. Her smile came cautiously, then all at once, and John, from a distance, finally looked up. The orchard rustled behind the moss-soft breath in the windows. Ellie took her mother's hand. Beside the old tree, the earth tucked itself around a secret promise, quiet but sure. The orchard wore its blossoms like a quiet benediction, a hush of pale pink and white gently draping each twisted bough. Wind moved through the petals as though careful not to disturb the moment, a reverent silence settling over the land as if even the plains held their breath. John stood just beyond the fence, his gloved hand resting on the weathered wood, eyes fixed on the oldest of his apple trees, the grafted one. It had bloomed every year, but never quite like this. There was a fullness to the petals, a confidence in how the limbs stretched themselves towards sunlight, as though the tree had finally remembered the shape of hope. He drew in a slow breath, the scent faint but familiar. Behind him came the quick rush of light feet. Ellie, darting between sprigs of wild onion and new grass, her black braids swinging at her back. "Miss Ellie," he said without turning, "I believe your seed's waking." She skidded to a stop beside him, cheeks pink from exertion. Her hands, smudged with soil, pointed at the tiny sprig just cresting the earth near the apple trees, a dark green curl with the promise of weight and sweetness 1,000 days from now. "Oh," she breathed. "It made it." He glanced down at her, the corners of his mouth lifting just barely. "It did." From the cabin, the screen door creaked open. Martha stepped out with her apron still tied, brushing flour from her hands. She paused at the edge of the porch, a shadow of hesitation in her posture that had lessened each week but never fully disappeared. The wind stirred her skirts. She squinted toward the orchard, then descended the steps, slowly. "Supper's near ready," she said as she joined them, though her eyes, too, turned to that budding tree. "We'll be along," John replied. She studied the ground a moment, as though reading something in the soil. "I'd forgotten what apple blossoms smelled like," she murmured. "Someday," Ellie piped up brightly, "I'm going to fill a book with every kind of flow." "I see." Martha smiled faintly. "You've only got the one notebook, love." "Then I'll write small," Ellie said, decisive. John chuckled, a soft, dry sound like leaves shivering in wind. "That's how all great things begin," he said, with small handwriting and careful observation. A silence settled then, not heavy nor awkward, but reverent. The three stood side by side in the gentle light, framed by the barn's long shadow and the wind's soft communion with petals overhead. The chill of winter had broken, though the morning still bit one's fingers with memory, but something else had taken root. Later, after supper and as dusk pooled in the corners of the fields, John would gather his book of poems and sit on the porch. But for now, under the apple blossoms, he was still present. No longer a man merely surviving the season.